If Beethoven's first string quartet, which was just heard, was intended to show that he had learned the lessons of Haydn and that he had absorbed the styles and the traditions and the forms of the late 18th century, this first quartet from his middle Opus 59 group was really intended to show that he was no longer going to abide by those forms, that he was going to bend them to his own artistic and expressive will. And in 1800, just about the time that he finished writing the first 6 quartets, he wrote a letter to a friend of his whose name was Wenzel Krumpholz. He's a violinist that he knew, and he said, "I'm not very satisfied with my work thus far. From this day on, I will forge a new path." And he did that in a very big way in 1804, when he was 34 years old, with his third symphony, which he subtitled the Eroica. And it really is scaled on such an epic and heroic scale, and it's so outstripped in proportions and musical audacity, anything that had been composed until that point, that it lost a lot of his admirers. A lot of people didn't know what to make of it. And of course, we always think of it as being a mainstay of the repertoire, but in those days, it was the piece that basically defined him as a radical modernist, a revolutionary. It was his rite of spring moment. Of course, there are always people who are aficionados of the avant-garde, and one such person from that era was Count Andrei Kirillovich Razumovsky, who was the Russian ambassador to the Habsburg court there in Vienna. And he was a great wealthy patron of the arts, and he had built himself a huge palace on the outskirts of Vienna. He called it Palais Razumovsky. And it was sort of like, Trump Tower lying on its side. It's enormous, stocked it with arts and with antiquities. And he also kept his own eponymous string quartet. And the first violinist of the Razumovsky quartet was a gentleman named Ignaz Schuppanzig. And he was an admirer and an advocate of the music of Beethoven, and was to remain so for the rest of Beethoven's life. And he seems to have been the one who encouraged Razumovsky to ask Beethoven to write a set of string quartets, 3 quartets that could be played in his lavish palatial music room. And part of the arrangement was that Beethoven would interpolate Russian music, Russian folk pieces, into the fabric of these 3 string quartets. And so the first in the series is the one we're about to hear, F major, Opus 59, number 1. And it was written just about a year after the Eroica Symphony. And it was perhaps intended to be the string quartet or maybe chamber music equivalent of the Eroica Symphony, in the sense that it was much bigger, it was much more difficult, it was much more musically and technically audacious than any string quartet that he or anybody ever had written. And like the Eroica Symphony, it lost people, including Ignaz Schuppanzig, the violinist who had encouraged Razumovsky to commission it. He and the Razumovsky quartet rehearsed and had trouble wrapping their minds and their technique around this piece. Schuppanzig became more and more irritated. And finally, he began to complain to the other members, and Beethoven heard about this, and he said, "Does he really suppose that I think of his puling little fiddle when the Spirit speaks to me and I write something?" And maybe one of the most startling responses to this piece took place around that time. There was a cellist who was a friend of Beethoven's. His name was Bernard Romberg, and they had known each other since their teenage years. They had played in the opera orchestra together in Bonn. Beethoven was a violist. And at one point, Bernard Romberg was reading this piece with a quartet in Moscow. And they were trying to wrap their minds and their techniques around this piece and failing miserably. And they got to the second movement, which begins with a cello solo, all on one note. And Romberg became so incensed at this point that apparently he knocked the music off the stand, onto the floor, got up, and trampled on it. And he said, "This music is an undignified joke," which is really startling. I mean, not only because it's such a great piece, but coming from a cellist, because as you will hear in this piece, the cello is a real protagonist in this piece. And Beethoven, if anything, was the cellistic emancipator. He was the one who really from his very earliest year was writing cello sonatas like nobody had ever written before, cello parts in his string quartets and chamber music. And of course, even in the Eroica Symphony, you'll remember it begins with this rolling lyrical cello solo over a rather static harmonic accompaniment. And as you'll hear, Opus 59, number 1 begins with a rolling cello solo over a rather static harmonic accompaniment. And from the soft bottom of the quartet, it elides into the violin, and as you'll hear, it goes up over 18 bars to a huge fortissimo climax in the 18th bar. And this really telegraphs, I think, the scale of this piece and the fact that this is not going to be your grandmother's string quartet. I mean, this is going to be something completely new that nobody has ever written before. And the second movement, if you're curious to hear that one-note samba of a cello theme that so infuriated Bernard Romberg, there was an English musicologist in the 20th century named Sir Donald Francis Tovey who called that a vision of dry bones. And I think it was intended to perhaps mislead us, this jocular, joking scherzando style, into thinking that this movement would be easy to wrap our minds around, that it would be scherzo, trio, scherzo. But in fact, it's almost as long as the first movement, and it goes places where no scherzo, trio, scherzo has ever gone before or since. And it really, again, is this emblem of this new path that he was on. And the third movement, in a sense, may have been his funeral march, although it's not a march. He marks it mesto, which means lamenting, sad. And he even, in the epigraph, called it an acacia tree over my brother's grave, which is not very helpful because both of his brothers were alive when he wrote the piece. But it gives you, I think, the tone of the piece. And of course, it also features enormous cello solos, often in the excruciating upper register. And in the end, this long, dark night of the soul does end in a glistening violin cadenza, which takes us across the divide between the third to the fourth movements. And then we have that obligatory, contractually obligated trip to Russia. And he went into a collection of Russian folk music and he extracted one that he liked. And of course, the first instrumental voice that gets to sing it is that of his beloved cellist. So this great, revolutionary, unprecedented string quartet ends in this mood of breezy Russian heartiness. So enjoy it.